Welcome to the second discussion from the series of long-term thinking about the war in Ukraine that we have organized in Kultura Liberalna together with the Foundation for the Polish-German Cooperation, with the Zeit Foundation and with the Fritt Ort Foundation since March this year. During this seminar organized on March 14th, we all saw how difficult it is to think about long-term consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, I must say that the thoughts of many of us today are probably rather in Bucha, and with the terrible pictures and news that we have gained, we have heard from the journalists and also from the people who have seen what happened in Bucha, the killings of civilians. So this is very difficult. And during the first discussion, we experienced also a lot of emotions, not only analysis, but also emotions. And I do believe this was also very relevant and very important. Today, we will start to reflect on another subject. The first subject was the long-term consequences for Europe and for the West. Today, we would like to talk a little bit more about the transatlantic relations and also about the strategic independence of the European Union with respect to what is happening to Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine. Today, I am joined by distinguished speakers. In alphabetical order, those are Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, a non-resident fellow with the Global Public Policy Institute, François Isbourg, who will be a little bit late, but I will introduce him now, Senior Advisor for Europe of the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies and Special Advisor to the Paris-based Foundation pour la Recherche Stratégique. Jarosław Hrycak, Professor at Ukrainian Catholic University, Director of the Institute for Historical Studies of Ivan Franko National University of Lviv, and Eugeniusz Smolar, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Relations, as well as former Director of the Polish section BBC World Service. Without too much introducing now and too much speaking now, I would like to give the floor to the panelists of today. And I would like to ask Jarosław Hrycak to take the floor first.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and special thanks for organizing the things, because I believe this is something which we very need and we appreciate it very much. So thank you again. My statement will focus on 2 points. First point, as it was announced as a topic of our discussion about transatlantic integration. So this is in the best interest of Ukraine to have a real transatlantic integration or cooperation, rather to say, because basically in many occasions we don't really see the many cases of this transatlantic cooperation integration, so to say, because position of Brussels and Washington on one hand, and positions of different countries within the European Union, sometimes or quite often they are very much different. So what I'm saying here, that in a sense, Ukrainian crisis provides an opportunity to create a real Euro-Atlantic integration in terms of the real integration. So this is not the first time. I remember during the first Maidan, Timothy Garton Ash wrote something along this line. So the Ukrainian crisis of 2004, the first Maidan, created the first opportunity when Washington and Brussels worked in the same direction, in a very close cooperation, so to say. So then again, it was during the second Maidan and Crimea, and now we feel it very much, that we feel like this restoring Euro-Atlantic integration, of course, with all possible qualifications, but still I believe nowadays axis between Brussels and Washington works, but probably better on the Washington side than on Brussels side, but we really need this kind of integration, because without this integration, Ukraine could hardly stand in the long term. In a short term, yes, Ukraine could probably win the war or just have a very effective resistance, but in the long term, since this is the war of attrition, and this is war of attrition, The final results of war attrition depends on the resources. Ukraine could not match Russian resources, without a doubt. But Ukraine would have access to much richer resources if this would be resources of the Euro-Atlantic integration, so to say. So this is, I believe, essentially important for us, for our viability, sustainability of Ukraine. So this may sound as utopia, but I believe this is exactly meant when he started his aggression in 2014 and then nowadays, because he really believed that something like European integration is not possible. He believed that he was counting that Washington and Brussels would be very much on different sides on the reaction. And secondly, he believed that he would be able to speak with each country, European Union separately, say with Berlin, with Budapest, with Prague, with Warsaw, and some kind of deals he did during the fundamentally first in the case of Ukraine, bit of integration and cooperation. This is good for us. This is not probably that much utopia, or this is utopia which has all the chances to be real, and we really need this kind of utopia. So this is my first point. And the second point, from the point of Ukrainians, specifically Ukrainian perspective. I believe here we have some kind of repetitive pattern, is that the result of the first depend a lot on what has been going on in Ukraine and about Ukraine. This might be some kind of strange, but this is the conclusion that has been reached by several historians, including British historian Dominic Levin, who wrote a beautiful book on the First World War. And then we have the same impression of the Second World War, basically about the future of the come, more specifically Europe, because basically who will have control of Ukraine will have control of East Europe, who will have control of Eastern Europe, who has a control of the Europe, and then you have this kind of global demand. This industry has been criticized, and this is worth serious consideration. So what I'm telling here, we have Ukrainian question throughout the 20th century as a part of geopolitical question. It's not just national, geopolitical question, very much like it was Polish question in the 19th century, or Jewish question until the Holocaust, so to say, or German question until the fall of the Nazi regime. So this question has to be somehow resolved. My idea of the solution to Ukrainian question is to build viable liberal democracy. And in this sense, to become either symbolical or physical part of European community, European Union. But to do this, Ukraine could not do it on its own. No nation could do it on its own. It needs to somehow kind of say some outside help or outside help or assistance. So my final point, to finish with this, to solve this Ukrainian question, we really need kind of Marshall Plan. This is essentially important for us. You may call it Marshall Plan, could be Zelensky Plan, whatever, but Ukraine made a significant progress in reforming the country. And before the war, it was very close to kind of success. The complete success, especially as a result of the war and destruction of the war, we have something in these lines. So basically, if I may conclude somewhere, we need first a very strong, viable transatlantic integration, real integration between Brussels and Washington. Part of this integration would be granting some kind of Marshall Plan for Ukraine to solve Ukrainian question once and for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jarosław. I wanted to actually ask a follow-up question. As much as I would like to follow your thought and believe that the Ukrainian question could be solved, as you say, for good, do you think it's realistic? Given the plans of Vladimir Putin, is it possible now to really solve the question permanently with the transatlantic cooperation?
Okay. Actually, there was some. Thank you, Carolina. There was some irony in my words, and I believe you really easily catch it. No problem could be solved once and forever. That's probably consideration. But there's a viable solution, and the viable solution has a liberal democracy with a functioning market as a part of a free world, so to say. This is something we have to take it seriously, because since the 1981, we have some kind of, how should I say, some of doubts or some kind of concerns about viability of this model. Now, obviously, this model is viable, and why not Ukraine has this model, so to say? See what I mean? It's no final solution, without a doubt. I hate to say final solution because it has a kind of Holocaust connection here. But viable solution, yeah, I believe it's a very viable one, the one that suggests. More so that Ukraine has been very close to the solution before the war, and now it needs even more during and after the war.
Thank you very much, Sławko. I would like now to welcome Francois Isbourg, who has joined us. Hello, Francois, it's good to see you. And at the same time, may I ask you to take the floor now?
On the transatlantic side, we have good news and not so good news, not to say bad news. The good news, and this I think was not entirely expected, is that in Washington, D.C., there wasn't much of a disagreement or debate on whether there is a trade-off between handling Russian-related issues and China-related issues. There was a little bit of discussion in the think tank world, a couple of pieces in the journals here and there, but overall, the fact that the US was investing itself politically in the conflict concerning Ukraine was not seen or treated as being at the expense of the China priority. That, you know, those voices which are saying, why are we doing all of this stuff against the country which has the size of the GDP of Italy, that's Russia, by the way, and Ukraine is so much less important than Taiwan. Maybe we should focus on our real priorities, China. This did not happen, and that's very good news. And indeed, the reverse happened. That is, people have, I think, quite widely understood that if the United States is not able to handle a problem concerning Russia and Ukraine, there would be little chance that it would be taken seriously in case there were a big problem concerning China and Taiwan. Now, we don't know whether this will extend into a different political situation in which Trump or a Trumpian president would replace Joe Biden, or where Joe Biden would be replaced by an as yet unknown Democrat or by Kamala Harris. But this is good news. Second piece, and that's the bad news, is that America and the power elite in America tends to draw its lessons concerning deterrence and escalation not from the Cold War, but from the failures of the Obama years, and specifically the Red Line crisis of 2013. There is nothing which makes the current administration more uneasy than the notion of red lines. Now, this is understandable since the Red Line crisis of 2013 was indeed an enormous failure, which every dictator in the world has drawn his own conclusions from, and it will continue to haunt us for many years. So one can understand that the administration has been very careful not to draw red lines, but in so doing, it has actually committed the symmetrical sin of drawing reverse red lines. From mid-February onwards, even before the war began, we had statements from the White House saying, we will never send American troops to Ukraine. Now, strategically, I don't have a problem with that. It probably was wise not to send American troops to Ukraine if the objective was to avoid a war between the United States and Russia. But why say so if you don't have a good reason to say so? You don't renounce an option unless you are forced to do so. This is one of the big lessons of escalation management during the Cold War. And it started with that. Then it continued with the no-fly zone. Oh, we'll not do a no-fly zone. But here again, it's perfectly arguable that it would have been a bad idea to have a no-fly zone. And that was the view taken by NATO as a whole. But why say so unless you are forced to do so? Because, of course, the risk is actually very high that if a particularly egregious atrocity, like the use of chemical weapons against the civilian population, would the American government do essentially nothing whatsoever at the military level? No American troops, no-fly zone? I actually doubt it. I actually think there would be movement. That the movement would actually be reactive and escalatory rather than a form of escalation dominance. The Americans and with them their allies should not have gotten themselves in a situation of saying never when in practice it may mean the opposite. And the same, of course, happened in a much worse way, albeit less important way, with the issue of so-called offensive weapons. On day one, the Americans said, okay, let's have Soviet-era fighters being transferred to Ukraine. Then the next day they would say, well, no, maybe. And then the third day they would say, yeah, sure. And then the fourth, I mean, the Poles are well placed to know what happened. And we're now going through the same process with the Patriot for S-300 swap between Slovakia and the United States. And here again, it's not only the US, it's also the other allies have taken a similar view. We have left Putin as the master of the escalatory process. We have put ourselves in a situation where he recasts the rules of the game. There is nothing in international law which prohibits providing weapons to a country which is exercising its Article 51 of the UN Charter rights of self-defense. There was nothing escalatory initially about providing MiGs or Sukhois to replace the MiGs and the Sukhois that the Ukrainians had before the war, or now to replace the T-72s, which the Ukrainians actually had in great numbers before the war. I think that the number I picked up was 558. So if one transfers a few hundred T-72s to replace these, why the hell consider this as a gratuitous escalation? Well, you only do that if you have this Obama syndrome, which pervades the US. And I said it's not only the US, but in practice, Article 5 is a package deal. That is, a given country of the alliance is not going to do something which another country is going to view as incredibly dangerous and in terms of escalation control. And therefore, if the US finds it to be a very bad idea to send Sukhois or T-72s to Ukraine, then other NATO countries have to take that view into account, and they do so indeed, even if that is not necessarily their inclination. Here again, Poland, I think, is a pretty good example. So we have a situation of self-deterrence, of escalation control by Putin, of inflexible response, and what the French, in their own version of deterrence theory, call on the part of Putin aggressive sanctuarization. That is, to use the sanctuary which nuclear weapons provide you to engage in much more aggressive behavior in the conventional arena than you would otherwise have done so. That's the transatlantic side. On the EU side, on the European side, what do we have? Well, first of all, we have the reminder, for better or for worse, given what I just said, that only the United States is in a position to dictate the rules of deterrence, including of extended deterrence in Europe. No European country is today in a position to do so. France, Britain have comparatively modest nuclear forces. To give them the role which US nuclear forces provide is not today a practical policy. So there's that reminder of the centrality of US extended deterrence. And that means that whatever the EU does, however successful the changes which are taking place in the EU are, we will still have to continue to rely on this unique American capability. And which of course begs the other question: if the US no longer wants to provide that unique capability in case of political change in the US, then the Europeans will be in a rather uncomfortable position. The second piece, the second lesson that we are learning is that the EU and NATO operate and can operate in a complementary manner. Whatever we have been doing to face the Russian invasion and to help Ukraine face the Russian invasion has been done in very close concert between NATO and the EU, with a rough division of labor between what each organization knows how to do best. You want economic sanctions, you can't do them without the EU. You want arms transfers to Ukraine. You can't do them without the military wherewithal of NATO's members. So these are basic but useful lessons, because they actually lead reasonable people to assume that we are no longer in the age of crude opposition or theological opposition between those who view NATO as the single player or those who preach EU strategic autonomy. The answer is we need both, and that they're complementary and not in opposition. In conclusion, the Europeans, and we are Europeans here, we have now to assume that America, the nature of America's commitment is liable to change. I mentioned some of the reasons for change, like Trumpian, a return to a Trumpian universe. But there's also a deeper trend. Of course, there are two deeper trends. One, which is well known, which is the China issue. Of course, American energy and resources will in the future be mobilized more and more by the Chinese contingency. But the other one is that America's definition of what is allowable, permissible in support of the self-defense of other countries, except for the Article 5 NATO members, that definition has been changing, and not for the good. You will have noted, for example, that when the Ukrainians did this very daring operation against the fuel farm in Belgorod, in Europe, I think most people assumed that, well, yeah, sure, this is a smart operation, and the Ukrainians are responding to the invasion of their country. And they're doing so on the territory of Russia, which is certainly not a bad idea, given that the Russians are invading Ukraine. In the States, CNN coverage was about what can we do to keep the Ukrainians from doing crazy stuff? That's the mood music. And the same goes, of course, for what I said on the transfer of weapons. How can it be escalatory to transfer to Ukraine weapons which Ukraine already had before the war, and which have been destroyed in large quantities in the military actions? You replace T-72s with T-72s, you replace BMPs with BMPs, and so on and so forth. How can this be escalatory? And yet this is the mindset into which the Americans appear to have worked themselves. Mm-hmm. And this is something very, very troubling for the Europeans, because because, you know, whether one wants strategic autonomy or not, one is going to have to assume that there are certain things that we're going to have to do on our own, because the Americans are no longer ready to do them. Now, I'm finishing on a very French note, but it's not, I'm not singing praises for the French approach. There are many things that we have been doing wrong, but simply the reality is that we are going to have to do more stuff by ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francois. And if I also can have a follow-up question for you. I have been quite moved by what you have said about the bad news about the transatlantic relations, namely the Obama syndrome, how you called it. And I must say, I found it very enlightening. We have been discussing a lot in the milieu of Cultura Liberalna why Joe Biden said those things, said that he would not send troops to Ukraine. It felt completely, it felt very difficult to understand from the Eastern European point of view to say such things, even if I agree that strategically this might be the right decision, but saying this obviously had an escalation potential for Vladimir Putin. It namely assured him that he would just get away with it, right? So it was quite enlightening what you said, and I wanted to ask, because we are talking about the long-term consequences. Do you think that the Obama syndrome might be cured?
In our part of the world, I fear not. I mean, I said that the good news was that in this crisis, we have not seen a sacrifice of Europe to the Chinese priority. That's the good news, and to some extent, maybe not entirely expected. That situation may continue to prevail, but it's not going to get any better. It can get worse. I mean, I don't think that Donald Trump, if he came back to power, would take a similar view, given his very simplistic manner of handling complexity. Because it is complicated to explain that the defense of Taiwan begins in Ukraine. Strategically, I can make the case, but in political terms, it's not necessarily that easy to make that case, particularly when you're not inclined to make it. So a turn back from the Obama syndrome, unclear. Indeed, in the Middle East, Trump was the perfect extension of the Obama doctrine. And Biden, of course, with Kabul, showed that he was also, to some extent, belonging to that school. And here I'll introduce a reading of Kabul, which is maybe a bit different from the one which has prevailed in Europe. In Europe, when the Kabul thing happened, we were unhappy because we were not consulted before, but that's you know, what else is new? And secondly, we found that it was a demonstration of incompetence and weakness, which it certainly was to some extent. From what I understand in Russia, in the strategic community, such as it is, the reading was a little bit different. That is, they drew the conclusion that Biden was ready to run political risks to actually do what he said he would do, which was to focus on China. Stop the forever wars, which take place in the greater Middle East, and concentrate on China. And if that means that you have to do a botched pullout of Kabul, you do a botched pullout of Kabul. That it was taken to some extent as a sign of determination rather than as a sign of collapse. A form of determination to do something which, of course, greatly pleased Putin, which was that the US was signaling, so it would appear to him, as being ready to drop Europe in order to be able to focus on China. Paradox is that Putin acted as if there were a zero-sum game in terms of choosing between the transatlantic dimension and the trans-Pacific dimension. He was disappointed in this area as he was in others, and that's obviously good news. But we cannot assume that this is the long-term trend. The long-term trend is that China will indeed become a bigger and bigger priority for the United States, whoever is president.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Francois. And Gienek, in this situation, please do take the floor.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this and seeing some friendly faces I haven't seen for such a long time, which is a shame, of course. And well, you know, generally speaking, being a Polish skeptic, I am looking both at the sources of strength and of the weaknesses of the transatlantic relations. And we all agree that Putin has failed strategically and that his aggressive war was met with the incredibly heroic and determined and effective Ukrainian defense. And that has caused political isolation, comprehensive economic sanctions, and indeed it strengthened US and NATO military presence on the eastern flank. What's more, in Sweden and Finland, support for the joining NATO has been increasing, which is everything that Putin wanted to avoid by embarking on this catastrophic aggression. Now, what could be the sources of friction? First of all, President Biden's characterization of Putin as a butcher and war criminal who should not rule Russia heralds a refusal to negotiate with him and sends a signal both to Russian ruling elites and to the West European allies that improved relations will be possible after Putin. This is very risky. And it is risky also because irrespective of Russia's scope of territorial gains, Moscow will inevitably raise a condition of any settlement on the immediate lifting on sanctions, which could be a serious impediment to a peace agreement. So such a publicly stated objectives, well, I fully support what Francois has said, that Washington's policy was to proclaim what we will not do, and not just to shut up and let Kremlin guessing what Washington and the European allies might do. But I believe that such a publicly stated objective will most likely become a source of friction, as they are unlikely to be supported by the European allies, who tend to rely on negotiation, whatever the circumstances. And Macron's almost weekly talks with Putin to persuade him to do something is a very good example of this. Also, I do not believe that the slogans of a worldwide struggle between democracy and authoritarianism will appeal to the Europeans, fearing that they are going to be drawn into a direct clash with China, sometimes along the line. But generally speaking, we are witnessing a major shift initiated by Trump against China and deepened by Biden after the Russian aggression from what could be called a cooperative competition within the framework of globalization to an ideological conflict of civilizations defined as a struggle between democracy and autocracy. And in Warsaw, Biden announced a protracted new Cold War in relation with Russia. I think that this will be a problem to many European governments. And Biden, upon taking office, he really invested a lot of his political capital to strengthen relations with the European allies, reinforced the importance of NATO and of the European integration, which is important. And of course, Putin did a lot to integrate further the Western alliance with his attack on Ukraine. Probably, and this is important, Putin was emboldened by Russian, but also by very many Western analyses of a picture of the world in which America's influence weakens and other powers will be able against the US and the entire post-war structure of international relations to pursue their interest for the spheres of influence by force. And to deepen cultural conflicts, to isolate their societies. Putin has failed to take into account the bravery of the Ukrainians and the recognition by the United States, also by the Europeans, that the struggle for the future of Ukraine has become a clash for the threatened security interests and values of the West. And this is something which Slavko has spoken about. The good thing is that the Allies have demonstrated in a very short time that it was wrong to see the West as weak, divided, lacking determination, even decadent, which would subordinate everything to economic interest. The autocrats did not understand that, as in the past in the face of Nazism or Stalinism, the West is able to mobilize its defenses or in defense of its interests and values. Unfortunately, Ukraine, which was not at the center of policies since 1991, is paying a very high price, still unknown. I strongly believe, adding what Francois has said, that the more decisive moves before the invasion could have prevented it. Now, US policy goal seems to be to defeat Putin, also as a warning to convince the Russians, the Chinese, and all other potential adversaries, but also to convince the allies that after a period of fighting terrorism and focusing on the Chinese threat, the nature of US-Western relations and the scope of influence has entered a phase of far-reaching change on a global scale. Here, I slightly differ with what Francois has said. As a consequence, the credibility of Western alliances have been strengthened within NATO and bilaterally by the US with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. This is of a great importance because fearing America's withdrawal from several hotspots in the world in the past, several numerous smaller states, especially in Asia, have begun to adapt to a new situation and look for ways how to accommodate Beijing interest in a few recent years. Now, China, it's at the center of Washington attentions, but I have no doubt, and there are many sources that confirm that China will certainly be influenced by the revealed weakness of Russia, both in terms of conventional military strength, state structures, and economy. On top of it, Putin has shown himself to be an adventurer, threatening Beijing long-term, mainly economic interests in the face of a very deep economic integration of China with the European markets and with the American economy. Now, in practical terms, hostilities have threatened the security of the new Silk Road through Russia, Ukraine to Poland, and through Poland to Western Europe. And it is reasonable to believe that the determination, depth, and effectiveness of sanctions will prompt the previously assertive Xi Jinping to be more cautious about partnering with Russia in undermining Western influence. Now, let us note important difference between NATO and the European Union. Within the EU, governments defend their interests, compete, clash, sometimes even veto various policies. Hungary and Poland are in conflict over violation of the rule of law. On the other hand, in the same city, the same governments vote through what is necessary at NATO. And as Francois have already said, the determining element is the presence and the role of the United States. But the constant proclamations, like in the American films where sweethearts talk to each other, I love you too, I love you, I love you too. I mean, these present constant proclamations of unity of the West do not remove my anxiety about the future of the transatlantic alliance, as its sustainability is absolutely crucial. Now, we cannot ignore the persistent distrust, mainly in Western Europe, of dysfunctional domestic policies of the United States, the painful experience of Trump, and the real possibility that Trump himself or a Trump-like product will return to power. And I am not optimistic here, as the uncertainty is reinforced by the almost certain prospect of Republican winning a majority in both houses of Congress in November by elections. This must affect a sense of uncertainty about the future US policy, and the tendency in Europe to develop the capacity to act independently in the security domain. Now, progress has recently been made in creating the foundation of a common security policy by agreeing to the so-called EU strategic compass. Like very many documents, it means nothing if there won't be any deliverables. So, but actually, after a few years of bickering, the member states quickly agreed on a common threat assessment and a joint action plan until 2030. A rapid deployment capacity with 5,000 soldiers is to be formed by 2025, and at the same time, a coalition of the willing will be allowed if a unity of all cannot be achieved. Finally, the partnership with NATO and the United States is to be strengthened. This is, however, a very far cry from a notion of European sovereignty or of strategic autonomy. And no one better expressed this problem than Francois himself on Twitter. Francois, I am quoting you, in November 2021, where he wrote, and I quote, "President Macron repeatedly and the new German coalition put forward the notion of European sovereignty. I understand the politics involved. Sovereignty isn't frightened with the controversial aura of strategic autonomy. However, European sovereignty is much more demanding than strategic autonomy. Autonomy only requires capability that you can buy them with money. EU sovereignty requires the same, plus the existence of a single executive, i.e. state power, like a federal Europe." And Francois asked, "Ready, guys?" Well, the answer is no one is ready, including France, Germany, and Poland. So, let's leave this bullshit and talk about realities. Also, what worries me is the proclaimed unrealistic vision of a majority voting on matters on foreign and security policy proposed by previous and the present German government. Who will agree to this in the present circumstances? Would France, if it were to be outvoted on matters of war and peace, or of life and death, or the future of its military industry, arms industry? The reason is not just self-interest, which is evident, but also a lack of trust. So, also I tend to take a longer view. That means the political culture and past practices. The fact that the Europeans, and I mean the Western Europeans, mainly Germany and France, refused to draw conclusions from, and I will cite this, Litvinenko murder, 2006, proclamation of the Russian word concept, and 2007 Putin's speech to Munich Security Conference, as well as cyber attack on Estonia. Putin's speech at the Bucharest NATO-Russia summit and territorial claims on Ukraine in 2008. Invasion of Georgia, 2008. Moscow's pressure resulting in Yanukovych 2013 decision to abandon association agreement with the EU. Annexation of Crimea and part of Donbass in 2014. Novichok attack on Skripal in Salisbury, 2018. Berlin's court verdict that Russia was behind Zeliman Kangoshvili murder in 2021. And finally, we have now a full-scale war against Ukraine into 2022. Now, very general overview, and I hope that someone will contradict me, but we have been dealing with the European elite, which is dominated by a generation brought up in times of prosperity and relative stability. And this elite has been shocked by a war. A generation for whom challenges were competitiveness on the global market, unemployment, terrorism, the influx of migrants from the south, or finding resources for growing social needs, mostly at the expense of the defense expenditure. Now, under the shock of war, they have to take, and some, like in Germany, they did take dramatic decisions to which neither they nor their voters have been prepared in advance, mentally, economically, or military. So now, even in Germany, many people from almost all political parties, with the exclusion of the Linke and radical right, has been criticizing Angela Merkel for her dealing with Putin. Also, I must say, and I hope that Francois will not be offended, from the outside and from Polish point of view, France's president's policy from Chirac and Sarkozy to Macron, Hollande didn't know whether he's coming or going, have been seen as unpredictable, almost autistic, following Gaulle's tradition determined to forge Paris' independent role in relation vis-à-vis the US, also to balance Germany's position in Europe through forming independent relations with the Soviet Union in the past and with Russia now. From our point of view, France has shown a kind of désintéressement impérial towards Central Eastern Europe after 1989, a particular example of which was its opposition towards the Eastern Partnership project. Also, expectations brutally expressed by President Chirac in the context of the Iraq war that, I quote, Eastern Europe lost a good opportunity to quiet. And we should also note that unlike Germany, French companies did not show any particular interest in the industrial investment in the region on a massive scale comparable to the German ones. And now we have two other examples. Macron's back decision of numerous French companies to remain in Russia now. And that has definitely weakened the United Front. And let's add to that a truly shocking information that in spite of the 2008 European Union decision not to supply arms to countries in armed conflict, between 2014 and 2020, France, Germany, and 8 other European countries supplied Russia with the valuable high technological components that now had been used by aircraft and tanks in Ukraine. This is truly ask a question, understanding that NATO is a political military alliance. That means a political decision will have to be made how individual governments will react to the challenge. You know, it actually it actually provokes us to ask a question: how reliable are the European allies? So I have to end here because otherwise Carolina will kill me. I believe that differences of approach between the Americans and European, mainly two major European powers, might become a source of friction, resulting in a weakening of transatlantic alliance. And let me add to the last words. I mentioned that Angela Merkel's policy towards Russia, there was a lot of criticism. Also the France one. I will remind you of a hero of a popular American cartoon sitcom, Homer Simpson. He once formulated the nature of lying. It takes two to lie, one to lie and one to believe. Berlin believed in Moscow assurances disregarding the trajectory of the events. And these are facts, not analysis or opinions. I don't know who believed in Paris. Also, the head of military intelligence, General Eric Vidor, who was alleged to have shown incompetence against the background of Russian aggression against Ukraine, was dismissed on Thursdays. Amen.
Thank you so much, Genek. This was probably the most decisive evaluation of
a bit provocative
evaluation of basically Western in comparison to Eastern European politics towards Russia. I quote, unpredictable, unstable, almost autistic. I would like to give the floor now to Katherine Kluwer-Ashbrook, who is back with us. And first question, of course, I have to you is how you, from both German and American perspective, look at the arguments that you have heard today, including Genek's provocative last arguments.
Well, first I had to find myself silently applauding. That's the beauty of Zoom to the last statement. So I really appreciate that kind of clarity and that sort of potentially divisive decisiveness, but I think that's what we're here for, to have this discussion. You know, tying a couple of points together, and I guess that's the pleasure of going last, that one doesn't have to repeat oneself or others, a best case scenario. I think I completely agree with the last point, which is to say, number one, we're seeing very clearly that the United States, at least for the time being, and I'll reflect a little bit about the domestic issues, some of which Francois mentioned, but I think we can go one level deeper and look there a little bit at the fate and structure of the Republican Party, because that will have an impact on how this plays out over time now, and I'll do that in just a second. But look, the United States, as Madeleine Albright has said, and may she rest in peace, is in this case the indispensable nation. We've already mapped out why, not least because the functional nuclear deterrent umbrella, but because it managed to get over this idea. And again, the arc was that, you know, this American president said America's back, then immediately fell back into sort of the American hubristic muscle that, yes, it wanted America to be back, but it still wanted Europe to fall in line. The Europeans thought at the beginning of this administration, of course, that they had now achieved somewhat more of a parity in terms of dealing with one another, transatlantic partners at a level of maturity. Of course, before the Ukraine crisis, you know, around Afghanistan and around AUKUS, the idea there being that, again, the United States thought that they could sort of be in the lead, dictate the timetable, have that sort of, again, hubristic attitude toward how transatlantic relations would work, then had to go back and lick their wounds, because they very clearly figured out that that did no favors to this Biden administration. And now you have truly the kind of advocated partnership that you really need. In fact, more so in some regard, if you look at the level of summitry on the Thursday before last, the degree to which, I mean, again, that was historic in modern reflections, because since George W. Bush, of course, you didn't have US-EU summitry in the way that you had it on that Thursday in that rapid succession. And the fact that the American president effectively set that agenda and sort of created the kind of tools and put yet again on the table the kind of tools that I think will create at least some cohesion. And everybody here has mentioned the factor of time, and I'm sure we'll have this out in our discussion, because I think time is the major unknown factor here. How long will this conflict go on? I think we've just over the last 2 days, Carolina, and you mentioned Bucha, I think that is in some regards could be this war Srebrenica moment. And then what does that do? And I'll reflect a little bit about what that does to the German public discourse, because the statement before, I think, mapped beautifully what we were seeing in the talk shows, in the German talk shows yesterday, which is this reluctance to fully engage, particularly on the economic piece, this sort of protectionist attitude toward German wealth and German status quo. I think that will have to shift relatively rapidly based on what we have seen over these last 2 days. And I think those images will, I think, for the German public, push Germany forward in a different way. But let me stay with the United States for just a half a second longer. So what did you see from the United States? Let me just do a very quick enumeration, because I think we haven't really put sort of the points on the table. I mean, not only the in the driving seat in terms of the construction of the sanctions regime, the fact that you had, the push from, on SWIFT, ultimately, and the haste on SWIFT come from the Americans. But, the kind of things now that will allow, at least for the Europeans, to stick together for longer, at least on paper. This idea that, at the summitry, the president offered, or Friday morning after the summitry carousel, the EU-US energy partnership. It's not enough. It won't be enough. But again, the United States, the pull of the United States, and it was mentioned earlier, brought Australia and Japan to the fore, that immediately volunteered liquid natural gas transfers to Europe. Again, we don't have the terminals. There are all sorts of technical issues that are there, but the United States, in a capacity to rally a global coalition, to put pressure on China, to be in deep discussions now with India, to sort of do triangulatory diplomacy in the way that no other power can. So the summary of that is, the myths of American declinism are highly overrated still, at least at this very moment. The fact that, you have that the president proposed a sanctions control body that would be transatlantic in nature, which is obviously vital in looking at sanctions enforcement and the effect of secondary sanctions, and having the kind of metrics that you'll need to hold sanctions over time and add sanctions now, which we'll potentially see this week. the fact that you have internal US consultative changes with respect to, or potential changes, I think we'll see now with how the United States thinks about the nuclear posture review, its national security strategy. It's held all of those back because these elements where it's trying to, the signaling component here in American diplomacy is of critical importance, as others have pointed out, which is to say, they're really looking for the right words and the right frame in which they're going to express the balance between their interest and core commitment to Europe and the avowed interest and focus on China and the authoritarian systemic rival that China represents. And then finally, there are those key components that, you know, some might see as the cornerstone again of sort of a re-emergent TTIP, which by the way is not going to happen, but the idea that the EU-US Tech and Trade Council you know, has begun working and will be catalyzed through this, certainly, because here you see that, you know, it'll be of crucial importance that the United States support and continue to invest in its partnership with NATO. But as everybody else has pointed out, the real proof, the time-measured proof, will be in the economic piece. Can the sanctions hold? Can the sanctions stick together? What are we going to do together or be able to do to speed the energy transformation? You know, can we, must we go with fracking? Can we, oh, I think my connection might be frozen again, I hope not. What can we do beyond with respect to renewables? All those issues are things that will have to be effectively resolved at the heart of the European Union. And now we're seeing an incredible, in my mind, the kind of historic creativity that, you know, a nodular structure like the European Union should have long been able to put on the table. But the fact that, you know, and this will get me to the American domestic circuit, that an appreciation of what is going on within the United States should spur the EU into further action. And I think Francois noted very well the kind of degree of connections you're going to have on the sort of weaponized interdependence piece and how you read weaponized interdependence and the actions that you take as a result at the heart of the EU and at NATO. So that nexus, the economic military nexus will have to be the line in which NATO and the EU work more closely together. Very clearly, and that, you know, energy, chemicals, major resources, nickel, palladium, all of those issues that affect the defense industry, that affect the automotive industry, all of those elements will underscore a need for NATO and the EU to work together in a different practical way beyond the major, just beyond the sort of defense components that we have addressed with the various different innovations that have come up over the last couple of weeks. On the American domestic situation, and I'll say then 2 more words on Germany and then I'll cap. On the American domestic situation, I think you have a highly volatile situation. I'll recall to this audience that the American Conservative Party was planning to have a Conservative Action Committee meeting in Hungary this spring. That you have within the heart of the Trumpist Republican Party, and up until very, very recently, a purported and strong narrative in favor of Vladimir Putin. That you have Fox News co-hosts and hosts and anchors that are supporting Russian action in Ukraine up to this point, which is to say that you have an inner conflict within the Republican Party, which will be very interesting to watch. Because I do think that, you know, before he waged an all-out war of aggression to try to annex territorially its neighbor and rebuild, a grand Russian imperialist vision, Vladimir Putin's first attempt was to dissolve NATO by influencing the Republican Party and a Donald Trump such that he would, in fact, weaken and dissolve NATO. And we now know that for the second, had there been a second Trump administration, that would have been very much on the table, if John Bolton and others are to be believed, which is to say that the Americans would have entirely retreated from NATO. So there is, in reverse, a European argument to be made to the Americans, who right now are still very much holding fealty to this idea that NATO and Western ideals need to be defended. You see major troop movements into Europe, and I think that deserves underlying. Yes, I think it's probably strategically foolhardy, to Francois's point, to sort of pursue the quote-unquote flipped red lines. And yet anything that would have smacked of or tasted of or seemed to this particular American society as it stands now as a way to put American boots back on the ground. That has been a trend in American public opinion that has long held. So there is no way in a domestic environment that a President Biden could have said anything to the contrary publicly. He could have held back, and I think that would probably have been wiser diplomatically, but he didn't and felt he couldn't. I think there are extreme dangers with respect to the continued derogation and changes to the electoral system in the United States that will, in fact, make it likely that we have at least a Republican, if not a Trumpian president in the White House going forth. And if that is the case, there will need to be a number of real deep strategic decisions made by the Europeans, and not only on the sketchboard, but in reality. And that gets me to the idea of European leadership within both NATO and the European Union. And this is one thing that has, and Carolina, you asked me about my two nationalities, that has been, I think, deeply disappointing to me, is the measured way, if you will, in which the German leadership has not fully yet understood that it can no longer be just the consensus-based, quote unquote, the consensus maker at the heart of the European Union, sort of this idea of Peter Katzenstein's tamed power in Europe, that it can remain this tied down Gulliver and still achieve its overall objectives in terms of its prosperity and economic security. I think those days are over. And it pains me deeply because now, in quote unquote, somebody noted that it's the generation that has grown up in prosperity, but we're also the generation, because this is my generation now in charge, we're also the second generation after the war. And there is this odd Stockholm syndrome that still sort of is in our bones. Our fathers, our mothers were in many cases born in the midst of the war, as is the case in my family. So that is to say that there needs to be some rapid shifts, but there is an amount of reticent fear, and I think that was made clear in the statement just ahead of mine, of an understanding of what a more activist Germany would look like here. But it's absolutely critical that Germany now understand, and this is a question of leadership, the pain point, both in economic terms and in terms of how leadership culture will have to change apace in this country to really confront the kind of situation that we're dealing with. And I think Bucha will be, for this particular political elite in Germany, a turning point. I think that this is the, you know, for this generation, although we all came of age during Srebrenica, you would think that that would have more lasting impacts now. But I do think that the next few days will see a hastening of an acceptance of having to catalyze certain things that are on the table with respect to the discussions on the oil and gas embargo. And the pain points this is very clearly going to cause, not only for people who are, not only for the companies, which are, I mean, BASF and others, big chemical companies, automotive companies are very clearly, I mean, they're already feeling the pain point. This is going to get worse. But what you're going to have to do creatively to create some countermeasures within the industry, in the industrial sector, and in terms of saving, quote unquote, German jobs is just going to have to be vital. That's just a fact of nature, and quote unquote, that will have to be figured out. And it will cost and it will be painful, but it is what Germany needs to throw into the collective European pot, if you will, to show that it has fealty to the wider European response to this crisis. So what will matter is time, decision-making, leadership always, and an ability for the Europeans to offer and counter-offer something to the Americans to make that coalition continue to be vital, even as we will witness very clearly a change in party dynamics in the 2022 elections in the United States and beyond.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I completely agree that what matter is time connected with decision making. As you say, I would only perhaps add, because I have been listening with a great interest what you have been saying, and I have been thinking that what actually matters here is that probably each of those sides that we are talking about, the US, the European Union, in the European Union, various countries, they also have a kind of collective syndromes or collective fears that prevent them from perhaps stepping further, making a step further. In the case of US, for example, Francois has been talking about the Obama syndrome, but then Catherine, you have been saying about what Germans think with their education and socialization concentrated on the Second World War. And this seems also to be a collective emotional syndrome. And if I understand correctly, the sooner we start to articulate those syndromes and those collective emotions and seek for a compromise, the better for Ukraine, but also for the stability of the global order.